The morning of the auction, there were 28 starving bulls nobody wanted. They stood in the farthest holding pen of the county livestock exchange, a forgotten corner where the rusted iron pipes of the fencing were bent and stained with the passing of countless seasons. The dust in this part of the yard was finer, undisturbed by the heavy boots of eager buyers or the energetic pacing of prime cattle. It was a stagnant dust, hanging in the air like a localized fog of failure. The bulls themselves were a testament to neglect, their bodies a landscape of sharp angles and hollow depressions. Their ribs protruded against their dull, matted coats like the wooden frames of unfinished boats left to rot in a dry harbor. Their heads hung low, the heavy muscles of their necks wasted away, leaving them looking disproportionate and deeply tired. They did not jostle for space. They did not vocalize. They merely existed in a state of suspended exhaustion, waiting for the inevitable end of their utility. The air around them smelled of sour dirt and the faint, metallic scent of slow starvation. In the main arena, the air was entirely different. It was charged with the electric hum of commerce, the rapid-fire chant of the auctioneer bouncing off the corrugated tin roof, and the sharp whistles of the ring men. Here, sleek, grain-fed steers and broad-shouldered heifers moved with nervous energy, their coats shining under the harsh fluorescent lights. The buyers sat in tiered wooden bleachers, a collection of men in worn denim and work boots, their faces weathered by the sun and wind, holding bidding cards with a practiced, casual authority. They were the established order of the valley, men who understood the language of weight and yield, of input and output. They bought potential, they bought meat, they bought the predictable mathematics of conventional agriculture. They did not buy charity cases. Through this crowd walked a young woman who did not belong to their mathematics. Her name was Cora, and she had returned to the valley only a month prior, retreating from a quiet, bloodless defeat in a city whose name no longer mattered to her. She was 28 years old, carrying the distinct stillness of someone who had recently discovered that the grand machinery of the modern world had no real use for her, and she, in turn, had no stomach for it. Her failure in the city had not been a spectacular explosion, but rather the slow, agonizing realization that she was a square peg being relentlessly hammered into a round hole. She had returned to the only thing left to her name, a neglected, multi-generational family farm that her grandfather had left behind, a piece of land that the rest of the county had long written off as unproductive and overgrown. Cora did not take a seat in the bleachers. She bypassed the main arena entirely, walking past the holding pens of the prime stock, ignoring the appraising glances of the men who recognized her grandfather's face in the set of her jaw but wondered why she was wasting her time. She walked deliberately toward the back pens, her boots kicking up small puffs of the stagnant dust. When she reached the pen holding the 28 starving bulls, she stopped. She hooked her arms over the top rail of the rusted fence and she watched them. She stood there for a long time, longer than seemed reasonable to the few yard workers who passed by. She watched the way they breathed, shallow and ragged. She watched the way they shifted their weight, favoring joints that ached from lack of cushion. She was looking for something specific, a spark of endurance, a stubborn refusal to fall, the way a rope frays to its absolute limit before it finally breaks. Eventually, the auctioneer's chant shifted. The prime stock had been sold, and the yard was clearing out. It was time for the remnants, the culls, the animals destined for the rendering plant or the dog food factory. The 28 bulls were driven into the ring, moving with a sluggish, reluctant shuffle. The auctioneer, a man who had known Cora's grandfather and who now looked at the emaciated animals with professional disdain, started the bidding at a price so low it was almost an insult to the breath left in their lungs. He asked for $50 a head. There was silence in the bleachers. The men who remained were packing their thermoses and folding their programs. He dropped it to 40. Silence. He dropped it to 35. $35 for the whole lot. The auctioneer amended, his voice losing its rhythmic chant, flattening into a tired plea just to clear the ring. $35 takes all 28. Somebody give me $35 just to get them on a trailer. In the third row of the bleachers, a man named Warren Vance leaned back and laughed. Warren was a prominent figure in the local agricultural community, a man whose farm was a sprawling testament to modern efficiency, chemical fertilizers, and heavy machinery. He was loud, successful, and fiercely protective of the conventional wisdom that had made him wealthy. $35? Warren called out, his voice booming through the cavernous room. I wouldn't give you 35 cents for that walking boneyard. You'd spend more on diesel hauling them to the ditch than they're worth. Cora raised her bidding number. It was a small, quiet movement, but in the stillness of the arena, it caught the auctioneer's eye immediately. I have 35, the auctioneer said, surprise momentarily stalling his cadence. 35 from the lady in the back. Do I hear 40? The silence that followed was heavy, thick with disbelief. Heads turned. Warren Vance stopped laughing, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Cora. He stood up, hooking his thumbs into his belt loops, projecting his voice so that every man in the room could hear the judgment. Well, look who it is, Warren said, his tone dripping with a condescending pity that was far worse than anger. The prodigal granddaughter returns to buy a graveyard. You just bought yourself 28 funerals, girl. You've thrown away whatever pennies your granddad left you on 19 head of dog food and 9 head of buzzard bait. They'll be dead before the week is out, and you'll be paying a backhoe operator to bury your mistake. Cora did not look at Warren. She did not lower her bidding card until the auctioneer slammed his gavel down, shouting, Sold? For $35, she stood up, her face impassive, and walked toward the clerk's window to pay. She had heard Warren's words clearly. He had meant it as a prediction of failure. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. Before we go further into Cora's story, if you appreciate these kinds of quiet, deliberate tales, please take a moment to tap the like button. And if you have a moment, leave a comment telling me the name of the town or city you are watching from, because I read every single one and I like knowing where these stories travel. Now let us return to the valley. The drive back to the farm with the hired trailer was slow, the weight of the 28 exhausted bulls anchoring the truck to the asphalt. Cora drove with the window down, letting the familiar, complex scent of the valley wash over her. It smelled of damp earth, crushed pine needles, and the faint, sweet decay of fallen leaves. When she finally turned onto the dirt road that led to her inheritance, the reality of her situation settled heavily upon her shoulders. The farm was a ghost of its former self. The main house, a 2-story farmhouse that had once stood proud and white against the green hills, was now peeling and gray, its porch sagging like a tired jaw. The great barn, built by her great-grandfather with timber hewn from their own woods, was leaning precariously to the east, its roof missing shingles like missing teeth. But it was the land itself that told the saddest story. The pastures, once lush and meticulously managed, were now choked with invasive weeds, thorny briars, and tough, unpalatable grasses. The fences were a tangled mess of rusted wire and rotting posts. To the eyes of the county, to men like Warren Vance, this land was a lost cause, a piece of geography that had outlived its usefulness and was slowly being reclaimed by the wild. It was a burden, a tax liability, a place that required a bulldozer and a fortune in chemical sprays to even begin to make it productive again. Cora parked the truck and began the arduous process of unloading the bulls. They stumbled down the ramp, their hooves slipping on the metal, their breath coming in ragged wheezes. She guided them into a small holding pen near the barn that she had spent the previous 3 days patching with salvaged wire and scrap wood. She filled a long, galvanized trough with water from the well, watching as the bulls crowded around it, drinking with a desperate, frantic energy that made her worry their fragile stomachs might twist. She threw them a few flakes of the only hay she could afford, a dusty, coarse, second-rate cutting that she had bought from a neighbor. That night, Cora sat on the sagging porch, wrapping her hands around a mug of cheap coffee, and listened to the silence of the farm. In the city, silence was an absence of noise, a temporary pause in the relentless mechanical roar. Here, the silence was a presence. It was the sound of the wind moving through the tall grass, the creak of the cooling roof metal, the distant, mournful call of an owl. She had no grand plan. She had no capital. She had only a profound sense that the city had been wrong, that the relentless push for more, faster, bigger was a hollow pursuit, and that here, on this broken land, there might be a different way to exist. Instead of scattering her energy in panic, something deep within her had settled. She felt like water finding its level. She had decided not to sell the burden she had inherited, but to attempt to understand it. The key to that understanding came 3 days later. The rain had set in, a slow, soaking drizzle that turned the yard to slick mud and kept Cora confined to the house. She had spent the morning cleaning out the front parlor, a room that had been sealed off for years, collecting dust and memories. In the corner, beneath a heavy canvas tarp, sat her grandfather's roll-top desk. It was locked, but Cora knew where the key was hidden, tucked behind a loose brick in the fireplace surround. She opened the desk, the wooden slats rolling back with a dry, protesting rattle. The pigeonholes were stuffed with old receipts, faded letters, and the ephemera of a long life. But in the bottom drawer, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, she found the true inheritance. They were notebooks, dozens of them, bound in cracked black leather or stiff canvas, their pages filled with her grandfather's precise, cramped handwriting. Cora carried the stack to the kitchen table, wiped the dust from the covers, and opened the first one. She expected to find simple farm logs, tallies of calves born, bushels harvested, and prices fetched at market. Instead, she found what read like the field notes of a man studying something he loved with an almost religious devotion. The notebooks were a chronicle of observation, a meticulous record of the relationship between the soil, the weather, the plants, and the animals. There were intricate diagrams of the pastures, noting which grasses thrived in the low, wet spots and which clung to the dry ridges. There were long passages detailing the movement of water across the land after a heavy rain, observing how the soil absorbed it or shed it. There were pages dedicated to the behavior of the cattle, noting which cows sought shade first, which ones ate the coarse weeds, which ones raised the strongest calves without intervention. As Cora read through the afternoon and into the night, a philosophy began to emerge from the pages. It was a philosophy of patience, of working with the natural inclinations of the land rather than trying to beat it into submission with machinery and chemicals. Her grandfather had not viewed the farm as a factory to be optimized, but as a living organism to be tended. He wrote about resting the pastures, about moving the animals frequently to mimic the ancient herds of bison, allowing the grass to recover and deepen its roots. He wrote about the folly of borrowing money against the land's future fertility. One phrase appeared repeatedly, underlined in heavy black ink, becoming a central thesis that anchored Cora's reading. The ground remembers. Her grandfather had written. It remembers the drought, it remembers the flood, and it remembers the hoof. Treat it like a bank account. You cannot withdraw more than you deposit, and force is the most expensive currency of all. And later, in a passage about the temptation of expansion, he had written, "Debt is a man telling the future what it has to do. The future rarely listens." Armed with the notebooks, Cora realized she needed context. The words were powerful, but they were the words of a dead man, and she needed a living bridge to that past. The next morning, she drove across the county to a small, neat house sitting on a ridge overlooking the river. It was the home of her great-aunt Martha, her grandfather's older sister. Martha was in her late 80s, a woman who seemed to be carved from the same hard, enduring wood as the old barns. She wore practical men's clothing, thick denim trousers and flannel shirts, her white hair cropped short. She was known for being terse, economical with her words, and deeply observant. Martha did not offer Cora tea or pleasantries. She sat on her porch, shucking peas into a tin bowl, and looked at her great-niece with eyes that missed nothing. Cora explained about the auction, about Warren Vance's mockery, about the 28 starving bulls, and finally about the notebooks. Martha kept shucking peas, the rhythmic snap and ping the only sound on the porch for a long time. Finally, she stopped, wiped her hands on a rag, and looked out over the valley. "Your grandfather was a quiet man," Martha said, her voice raspy like dry leaves. "He didn't argue with fools because it's like arguing with weather. You just endure it." She pointed a gnarled finger toward Cora's truck. Those notebooks are the map. But a map doesn't walk the trail for you. You bought the culls. The ones nobody wanted. I did, Cora said. They were cheap. And they looked stubborn. Martha nodded slowly, a microscopic gesture of approval. When you bring animals like that to a new place, they don't know the grass. They don't know the water. Conventional wisdom says you pump them full of grain to put weight on them fast. That will kill them. Their guts are shrunk. You have to teach them how to be cattle again. Martha leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Cora's. Listen to me closely. You move them. Every single day. You give them a small patch of grass. Let them eat the tops, trample the rest, and then you move them. You make them walk, you make them forage. And when you look at them, you don't look at the ribs. You look at the eyes. The ones with dead eyes you will lose. The ones with a mean, bright spark. Those are the ones that will build your herd. Your grandfather always said, by the ones that stood in the middle of the pen, the ones that watched you back. Cora took the advice and the notebooks and went to work. It was the beginning of a routine that was slow, unglamorous, and physically exhausting. The work was mostly invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. She had no money for new, permanent fencing, so she spent hours every day stringing temporary electric wire, creating small, tight paddocks across the overgrown pastures. She moved the 28 bulls every morning, driving them from a grazed section to a fresh one. First, it was chaotic. The bulls were weak, confused, and prone to breaking through the single strand of wire. Cora spent long hours chasing them through thorny brush, mending fences by hand, her arms scratched and her muscles aching. But she persisted, guided by the precise diagrams in the leather-bound books. She watched the animals closely, keeping her own notebook now, a cheap spiral-bound thing where she recorded which bulls were gaining strength, which ones were eating the tougher weeds, and how the soil looked after they had passed over it. She observed that the heavy trampling of the herd, concentrated in a small area for a short time, broke up the hard, crusted surface of the neglected soil. Their manure, rather than accumulating in a toxic pile in a feedlot, was spread evenly across the pasture, acting as a natural fertilizer. She was not just feeding the bulls. She was using the bulls to feed the land. The community, of course, was watching, and the community was talking. The local feed store, a sprawling metal building that smelled of molasses, dusty grain, and chemical fertilizer, served as the county's true circulatory system for gossip. It was here that the established farmers gathered in the mornings, leaning on the counter with their coffee, discussing weather, grain prices, and the apparent insanity of Cora's methods. Warren Vance was usually holding court. He would stand by the register, his voice carrying over the hum of the industrial fans. "Saw the girl out there yesterday," Warren would say, shaking his head with a theatrical sigh, "stringing a little piece of twine across the weeds. Those skeletons she bought are just walking back and forth, eating briars. It's a damn shame, really, letting that land go to total ruin. If she had half a brain, she'd borrow against the deed, clear-cut that brush, and put down some nitrogen. But she's playing house, playing pioneer." The men would chuckle, nodding in agreement. It was the consensus of the modern era. Nature was an obstacle to be overcome with force, chemistry, and capital. Patience was a luxury that did not pay the mortgage. Cora occasionally had to visit the feed store for essentials, a spool of wire, a pair of leather gloves. She would walk in, and the conversation would inevitably pause, the silence thick with unspoken judgment. Warren Vance, possessing the kind of arrogance that masquerades as neighborly concern, would often approach her with false friendliness. "Morning, Cora," Warren would say, smiling broadly. "How are those, special cases of yours doing? Managing to keep them upright?" Cora never flushed. She never got defensive. She had absorbed the lesson from Great-Aunt Martha and the quiet strength of her grandfather's writings. She would look at Warren with a calm, level gaze and answer plainly, without heat. "They are eating well, Mr. Vance. Thank you for asking. Well, just make sure you aren't starving them out there on that brush." Warren would press, trying to elicit a reaction. "Cattle need energy. You can't build a house without bricks. and you can't build beef without corn. That is one approach, Cora would reply, her tone so flat it took all the fun out of the question. She would pay for her items, nod to the men, and walk out, leaving an awkward silence in her wake. There was one man in the feed store who did not laugh. Elias Pratt, the old-timer who owned the establishment, would watch these exchanges silently from behind the counter. Elias was a man who had seen the cycles of boom and bust, who remembered when the valley was not completely beholden to the chemical companies. One rainy Tuesday, when the store was empty save for the two of them, Elias leaned over the counter as he handed Cora her change. "Your granddad," Elias said quietly, his voice a low rumble. "He used to buy the culls too, back in the 50s. Folks laughed at him then, same as they're laughing at you now. He told me once that a weed is just a plant that has mastered survival, and if you can teach a cow to eat it, you've got free feed." Elias tapped the counter with a thick finger. "You keep moving that wire, girl." The dirt doesn't care about Warren Vance's opinion. It was a small, private confirmation, the first external validation Cora had received, and she carried it with her like a shielded flame against the cold wind of the county's skepticism. The slow, invisible work continued through the spring and into the summer. The first tangible signs of success did not come with a fanfare, but in small, quiet moments. Cora noted them in her spiral notebook without ceremony, though she allowed herself to sit with the satisfaction of them on the porch at night. 3 of the 28 bulls had died in the first month, their bodies simply too broken to recover. She had buried them deep in the woods, returning them to the soil. But the remaining 25 had lived. More than lived, they had begun to change. The hollows in their flanks began to fill. Their coats, once dull and matted, began to shed out, revealing a sleek, healthy shine beneath. The listless shuffle was replaced by a steady, purposeful walk as they tracked the fresh grass. They were not the massive, bloated animals of Warren Vance's feedlots. They were lean, hard-muscled, and athletic. They looked like creatures that belonged to the landscape, not products manufactured upon it. And the land itself was responding. Where the bulls had trampled the weeds and left their manure, new grasses were pushing through the soil, native varieties that had laid dormant for decades, waiting for the right conditions. The soil, when Cora dug into it with her hands, was no longer hard and gray, but darker, crumbly, and smelling of rich life. By the end of the second year, Cora had sold a few of the bulls to a specialized buyer from 2 counties over who was looking for grass-adapted genetics. The sales were small, almost accidental, arranged through word of mouth. She did not advertise. The buyer had come, walked the pastures with her, looked at the dense, healthy grass and the strong, alert animals, and paid her asking price without haggling. The meat from those animals, the buyer later told her, was fundamentally different. It tasted of the land, rich and complex, a far cry from the bland, uniform product of the conventional system. A name for her operation emerged organically among the few who knew of it, Burnt Fork, named after the creek that ran through the property. But she engaged in no intentional branding. She simply did the work. Then came the great crisis. It arrived in the 3rd year, not as a sudden storm, but as a slow, suffocating absence. It was the worst drought in living memory. The winter had been unusually dry, yielding almost no snowpack in the surrounding mountains. Spring brought a few teasing showers, but by May, the sky turned a pale, unrelenting white, and the rain simply stopped. The heat pressed down on the valley like a physical weight, baking the moisture from the topsoil. For the conventional farmers, the drought was a catastrophe of mathematics. Their systems were designed for predictable inputs. They had borrowed heavily to buy chemical fertilizers, which now sat inert in the dry dirt, burning the roots of the struggling crops. They relied on shallow, fast-growing grasses that required constant rain, grasses that now withered and turned to crisp, brown straw. As the pastures failed, the farmers were forced to buy hay, but hay was scarce across the entire region, and the prices skyrocketed. Warren Vance's sprawling operation was hit the hardest. His massive herd of grain-fed cattle, unaccustomed to foraging and stressed by the heat, began to lose weight rapidly. The creeks on his property, stripped of the deep-rooted vegetation that usually held moisture in the banks, dried up completely, leaving cracked mud and desperate, bellowing animals. Warren was forced to haul water in tanker trucks, burning through diesel and cash at an unsustainable rate. The county was bleeding money, the land turning to dust, and the tension at the feed store was palpable, thick with fear and anger. But Cora's farm was different. It was not immune to the drought. The grass growth slowed significantly, and the heat was oppressive. But it was resilient. Because Cora had spent 3 years moving the cattle daily, never letting them graze the grass down to the bare dirt, the soil on her farm was covered by a thick layer of organic matter, a natural mulch that protected the earth from the sun and held onto every drop of moisture. Because she had allowed the deep-rooted native grasses to flourish, their roots reached far below the baked surface, finding water that the shallow conventional grasses could not. When the main creek on her property reduced to a trickle, Cora did not panic. She consulted her grandfather's notebooks. She found a passage detailing a specific ridge on the eastern edge of the property. In the dry year of 42, her grandfather had written, "The cattle found water where there was none. A seep, hidden under the rock shelf, covered by brush. Let them show you." Cora opened the gates and let the 25 bulls roam freely up the ridge. She watched them for 2 days. On the afternoon of the second day, she found them clustered near a rock outcropping, their heads down. They had pawed away the dry brush and loose shale, uncovering a natural spring, a slow but steady seep of clear, cold water that had been buried for decades. The bulls drank, and the water flowed down the ridge, creating a small, impossible ribbon of green in the brown landscape. From the county road, Cora's farm looked like a mirage. In a valley that had turned the color of old parchment, Burnt Fork was a green island. The contrast was stark, undeniable, and entirely visible to anyone driving past. People began to drive out just to look at it. They would slow their trucks down, idling by the fence line, staring at the deep green of the pastures and the healthy, contented cattle resting in the shade. It was a visual proof that defied the arguments they had heard at the feed store. The vindication was silent. Cora did not put up a sign. She did not go to the feed store to gloat. She simply continued the slow, unglamorous work, moving her temporary fences, managing the grass, and letting the results speak for themselves. The breaking point for the conventional wisdom came in late August. The drought had forced many farmers to sell off their herds at a massive loss, flooding the market and driving prices down to nothing. They were loading their cattle onto trailers and sending them to the same auction pens where Cora had bought her 28 starving bulls 3 years earlier. It was on a Tuesday evening, as the heat was finally beginning to break with the setting sun, that a truck pulled up the long dirt driveway of Burnt Fork. Cora was on the porch, wiping the sweat from her neck, when she saw it. It was a large, expensive truck, covered in the pale dust of the drought. The door opened, and Warren Vance stepped out. He looked older, tired, the loud confidence that usually preceded him stripped away by months of stress and financial hemorrhage. He did not swagger. He walked slowly up to the porch, holding his hat in his hands. Cora did not stand up. She waited. Warren stood at the bottom of the porch steps, looking out over the green pastures, watching the 25 bulls graze in the twilight. He looked at the grass, thick and resilient, and then he looked at Cora. "I drove past your lower field today," Warren said, his voice quiet, lacking its usual boom. "Grass is knee-high." "It is," Cora agreed, her tone neutral. Warren turned his hat over in his hands, staring down at the brim. He was a man who had built his life on being right, on dominating the landscape, and the admission he was about to make was clearly agonizing. He did not say he was sorry for his mockery. That was not the language of the valley. He simply stated the fact. "I was wrong," Warren said plainly, saying it not as praise, but as a kind of grievance against the order of things. "Everything I know, everything I've done for 30 years, it's turning to dust out there. And you bought a graveyard and turned it into an oasis." He looked back up at her, his eyes serious. "I have 200 head of cattle that are going to starve if I don't get them on grass. I will lease your lower pasture. I will pay you whatever you ask. And he hesitated, swallowing hard. And I want to know how you did it. I want to buy your breeding stock full price when you're ready to sell. I need genetics that know how to survive this. Cora looked at the man who had publicly humiliated her, the man who had predicted her ruin. She felt no desire to punish him. The land had already humbled him more effectively than any words she could offer. I cannot lease you the pasture, Mr. Vance, Cora said evenly. If I put 200 head of your cattle on it right now, they will destroy the roots, and the grass will not recover before winter. The land cannot bear that force. Warren's shoulders slumped. He nodded slowly, accepting the logic. I understand. But, Cora continued, I will sell you 2 of my bulls, and if you have the time, you can walk the fence line with me tomorrow morning. I will show you how I string the wire, and how to read the grass to know when to move them. Warren Vance looked at her for a long moment, the realization settling over him that he was not just being offered a lifeline, but an education from the woman he had dismissed as a fool. I'll be here at sunrise, he said. The conversion of Warren Vance did what Cora's own success alone could not. It sent a ripple effect through the valley. When the loudest skeptic, the most established conventional farmer, quietly begins to adopt the methods of the outlier, the community takes notice. The tide shifted. Other farmers began to visit Burnt Fork. They came cautiously at first, asking hesitant questions about grazing rotations and rest periods. Cora became a teacher, sharing the knowledge from her grandfather's notebooks freely. She would walk them through her fields, digging into the soil with a shovel to show them the dark, moisture-rich earth, pointing out the diverse species of plants that made up a healthy pasture. She explained that patience beats money, and that attention beats force. Among these visitors was a teenager named Tommy, the son of a neighboring farmer who had lost nearly everything in the drought. Tommy was serious, quiet, and possessed a work ethic born of desperation. He began coming around after school, offering to help Cora move the fences. Cora saw in him the same quiet observation that her grandfather had possessed. She began paying him, but more importantly, she began teaching him. Tommy had the hands for the work, an intuitive understanding of how the animals moved and what the land needed. He absorbed the ancestral knowledge deeply, representing the successful transmission of the legacy to a new generation. Despite the sudden demand for her knowledge and her cattle, Cora refused to expand rapidly. She refused to take on debt to buy more land or more stock. She adhered strictly to the business philosophy laid out in the notebooks. She grew the way the land could grow, letting demand pull the operation forward organically. In the autumn of her 5th year on the farm, Great Aunt Martha passed away peacefully in her sleep. She had lived just long enough to see the worst of the drought break, and to see Cora's farm thriving as the undisputed model of resilience in the county. A few days before she died, Cora had brought her a jar of preserves and sat on the porch with her. Martha had looked at Cora, her sharp eyes softening just a fraction, and said, "You learned to read the map, girl. He'd be proud of the dirt you've built." It was the final transfer of the wise elder mantle, and Cora felt the weight of it settle comfortably upon her. The story comes full circle in the late fall, as the valley prepared for winter. Cora found herself back at the county livestock exchange. She was not there to buy culls this time. She was there to sell a select group of her young bulls, the progeny of the original 28, raised on the philosophy of the notebooks. The auction yard smelled the same, the dust was the same, but the atmosphere around Cora was entirely different. As her bulls were driven into the ring, sleek, powerful, and alert, the bleachers were packed. The men in worn denim and work boots were not looking at her with pity or amusement. They were holding their bidding cards with intense focus. The auctioneer, the same man who had sold her the starving lot years ago, began the chant. The bidding was fierce, driving the price higher and higher, setting a record for the county. In the 3rd row, Warren Vance sat next to young Tommy, both of them bidding on Cora's stock. As the gavel slammed down on the final sale, Cora stood near the back of the arena. No one laughed. The community now understood the value of what she had seen in the rejected thing. The truth of the valley had been rewritten by a quiet woman with a stack of old notebooks and 28 starving bulls. It is a testament that the rejected thing is the valuable thing when you know how to read it. That patience beats money and attention beats force. That worth does not need to argue because in the end, it simply proves itself. If this story resonated with you, I ask that you share it with someone who might feel like they are not worth much right now, someone who is doing the slow, invisible work. And please, tell me about the thing in your own life that everybody laughed at. The small, stubborn thing you kept on with anyway. Leave it in the comments below because I read every comment. Everyone. I will read yours.